Hello, my name is JR Garcia. I'm the Director of Solutions Engineering here at ANM, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about securing generative AI applications. So this is a topic that's been coming up more and more over the past couple of years with the popularity of things like ChatGPT. So today I'm going to spend a little bit of time going over some various tools and techniques that you can use to try and secure and put some controls around these types of applications. So before we get into security, let's draw out a couple different examples here. The most popular being ChatGPT. And then there's also an API that OpenAI gives you, or that will allow you to use if you want to build your own applications. Because ChatGPT and LLMs like it are good for certain use cases. However, some organizations want to be able to query their own enterprise data set. And in those instances, they have to create their own private application that uses that API. So let's draw out what one of those looks like. Now, typically, these private apps have some sort of a web front end, much like ChatGPT. And then on the back end there is our data set. So this could be structured data. This could be unstructured data. So a database or just some documents, like a PDF, Word documents, PowerPoints as examples. Now, by default, this LLM isn't going to be able to query this data set, right? We need to put this into a format that is readable by something like a ChatGPT so that we can actually query this information. Now, one way to do that is to use a tool like Llama Index. Now, Llama Index is a developer tool that makes it a little bit easier for developers to create these AI applications. And what this will do is it'll actually read this data set and then convert it to a file that can be read by our LLM. So usually it's some sort of a JSON file as an example. Now, the next thing we need to do is actually do the API calls out to our LLM here. Now, there's another tool that's commonly used by developers called LangChain. And that'll do a number of things, but one of the things it'll do is aggregate all the various API calls that are necessary so that ChatGPT can access our enterprise data set, and then we can ask questions and do all the things that we typically do with generative AI applications. So this is a couple of different examples of various generative AI apps. Now, let's talk about what we can do to put some controls around some of these things. Now, the first thing we want to do, like most security conversations, is start off with the end user. Now, specifically, what we want to do is start off with AI governance. Now, that means compliance. That means user training. That's use cases. So understanding what use cases and documenting what use cases are allowed and which ones are not allowed. But ultimately, the end goal is to document a policy. Now, once we've got our policy documented, hopefully on paper or digitally, now we can use that policy to inform where we put security and where we put controls in these applications. Now, the most common thing that I've seen with organizations is a lot of times they'll just say, nobody can get to ChatGPT, nobody can use AI. Now, in those instances, you can just block that traffic with a next-gen firewall, right? Because you could do things like content filtering, or just website blocking, right? Now, let's say this user is remote. Maybe they're working from home or working at a Starbucks. Then in those cases, you could also use a tool like SASE or SSE. Now, not only can we do things like content filtering like we can on a firewall here, but we can also do things like CASB and DLP or data loss prevention. Now, along with SASE and SSE, there are some startups that are out there that can help augment our visibility with these tools specific to AI applications. So what those types of tools will do will kind of give us some additional capabilities around routing, redaction, and redirection. Now, what that means is, let's say, as an example, our policy states that our end user here is not allowed to go to ChatGPT. We could just, very similarly to the previous example, we could just block it, won't allow that user to route out to ChatGPT. Now, what about redaction? So let's give another example here with our policy. Let's say our user is able to use an LLM to create marketing material, but they are not allowed to use an LLM for things like resume summarization. So let's say our user tries to upload a resume to ChatGPT, and we recognize that there's some PII information in it, some personal identifiable information in that resume, things like phone numbers, email addresses, things like that. So what these tools allow us to do is to recognize that there is that type of info, and then based on our policy here, we can redact that information before it goes to ChatGPT. That way, personal information isn't being uploaded to a public LLM that's then being able to be queried by others. Now, this last one here, redirection. Let's say our policy states that our user is not able to use ChatGPT, but they are able to use our private application that we've developed. So what we could do is, based on our policy again, we'll recognize that this user is unallowed to go to ChatGPT, and we just redirect that to our private AI application, and then they get prompted by our private web front end instead of ChatGPT. Now, as another example, maybe this user can't use any LLMs, or they can't use any AI applications. Others can, but this particular user cannot. We can use the same SASE or SSE tool to be able to block even that internal web traffic as well. Now let's take a look at where we can put some controls around our private application. So once we've got some controls on the front door, we want to take a look at this data, so our enterprise data set. Now, Llama Index needs to have access to our data so that it can create a file that can then be readable by an LLM, but we don't want to give it access to everything. Let's say our policy states we only want to give it access to specific things and things that don't have any PII information in it, like social security numbers, as an example. Well, what we need to do is classify the data. So we want to do things like data classification here. So we want to be able to tag this data set to recognize what is allowed and what is not allowed to be sent over to Llama Index for reading. Now we can use those tags to then use a DLP tool to permit or deny that traffic to Llama Index. Now, looking at these tools, Llama Index and LangChain, these are two open source tools. Let's say, as an example, our policy states that we can't use any open source tools in our environment for whatever reason. So what we want to do is do some scanning, right? So we want to do some source code scanning to be able to recognize whether or not some of these tools are being used in our source code. So we can scan things like GitHub or even OneDrive to look at our source code and look to see whether or not any commonly used AI libraries are in our source code, and then alert on that. Okay, next we want to take a look at our API, right? Because these API calls cost money. So that's going to be an API security gateway. So this will allow us to do a few different things. Most importantly, though, is rate limit. So we want to rate limit the amount of API calls that go out to an OpenAI or ChatGPT as an example. Because again, those API calls do cost money. The more calls we send out there, the bigger our bill gets. Additionally, we want to do things like limit user access or developer access. So if we have some policy or some rules in place that state that only certain applications get access to this API and others don't, we want to be able to limit that access. And then lastly, just key management, right? We want to securely store our API keys so that they don't go out to places where they shouldn't go out to. So that is a very high-level summary of some ways and different tools that are out there that we can use to try and secure generative AI applications. If you have any questions or want to learn more, just send an email to info@anm.com. Outside of that, thank you.